Greetings, friends, and shalom. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be, whenever you happen to be watching this. I am your host, CJ Cox. Welcome to this episode of The Watchdog. This is the show where we remind you all that we are indeed living in biblical times. And want to also remind you guys of our little channel wide slogan here, which is to think like a Neanderthal, because Neanderthal thinking, or being normal, as it was called back in 2019, is what the left seems to be rallying against and has been for quite some time. So, being that we're against the left, let us think like our brethren, the Neanderthal. I'm obviously being coy, but nonetheless, shalom to you all, and thank you very much for being here. I appreciate you being here tremendously. If you are indeed here, go ahead and let yourself be known in the live chat. Please consider liking and sharing this video. Get it out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? Also, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified every time that we go live. We try to publish Watchdogs every Tuesday and Thursday, Mountain Time. So if you're watching this and it's live, but you're in like Canada or on the East Coast or something like that, you're like, hey, it's technically actually Wednesday. Well, it's not what I mean. Um, anyways, um, also try to post a discussion slash debate on Wednesdays. I want to eventually be up every Wednesday, but as of right now, we just uh, don't have the revolving door that is revolving enough to actually have a discussion or debate every single week. But we will eventually, Lord willing. We will eventually. Um, Please consider following me on the different social media platforms which you frequent. I am on Gab, Parler, Twitter, Facebook, and Minds. I strongly recommend you get on Gab or Parler or Minds, as they are alternative social media platforms that will actually respect your freedom of speech. And if you are not considered to be politically right wing by your own self, that's perfectly fine, because guess what? They are less echo chambers. They are less so echo chambers, excuse me, by virtue of your appearing on the platform. We want free speech for everybody, right? We don't just want free speech for one segment of the population. So if you're sick and tired of the lack of free speech on the internet, the lack of free speech you get on Facebook, on this channel here, YouTube, and on so many others, consider getting onto these alternative social media platforms. Again, Gab and Parler are the Twitter clones. If you like Facebook, there is also MeWe, which is a clone of that. And that leads me to my next point of order. Do consider following this channel on Rumble. Why Rumble? Well, first off, you'd have to find it at the synagogue. That's where you're going to find me everywhere else. And second off, because it is very likely that our time on YouTube is limited. Unlike the other channel, which still actually causes a decent amount of controversy despite its small size, this one, despite its even smaller size, is bound to cause controversy basically every episode. YouTube is not like political conservatives. They do not like the right wing. They're much more fond of the wrong wing. See what I did there? And so it's very likely that there will be some point in the future where we're not actually able to provide you live YouTube streams. But when that time comes, you'll have an archive of our videos over on Rumble, and we'll hopefully be able to actually get live, um, live Rumble videos at some point. You have to pay for those, which is why we don't do them right now. But hopefully, eventually, we'll actually have enough of a income on here that we can actually justify doing something like that. At any rate, just want to remind you guys to potentially go to all those different platforms, follow your boy, share this video while you're there. Lastly, but not leastly, if you want to help me turn this into a career, you can certainly do so by going to my Patreon or PayPal. The Patreon is a subscription-based service, right? I don't have tiers, so you can pay as little or as much as you like. The PayPal is, of course, a one-time service. Again, no tiers, so you can pay as little or as much as you like. If you consider this information to be relevant information, if you consider me to be doing a good job at giving you guys the news and all that, and if you'd like to help me turn this into a career, please do consider supporting me monetarily. I greatly appreciate anything that you send my way, and all I ask is that I have earned it, right? So, got an interesting show for you today on this not January, sorry, that was way wrong. July, July the 5th, 2022, the day after Independence Day. And that's what my pre-article discussion is going to be about, is, in fact, Independence Day. I definitely do celebrate Independence Day, as you might expect from a American who self-identifies as an American nationalist and as a patriot and as a conservative and so on and so forth. And we had a decent celebration yesterday. We're able to go up into the foothills to watch the fireworks. Cool thing about being up there in the foothills is you could see all the different fireworks from around the valley, right? So instead of just Boise's fireworks, we saw Boise's and Meridians and Eagles and so on and so forth. Super cool. But at any rate, I watched a video that Dr. James White came out with on his Alpha and Omega Ministries channel, which of course is not primarily a news channel. It is primarily, excuse me, a theology and apologetics channel. But nonetheless, I thought it was an absolutely brilliant video. And so I want to discuss it a little bit with you guys here today. So basically, the gist of the video was Dr. James White saying that it was hard to celebrate the United States of America this July 4th, even despite the Roe v. Wade ruling, because of everything that we had seen in the month of June. And really, if we're being realistic here, that we've progressively seen worse and worse since the 1960s, but which really, really, really blew up 2020 and prior. Really, you could say 2016 and prior. I think the Trump Sanders joint campaigns, not that they were together, but that they were in the same year, had a lot to do with the sort of explosion of absolute madness in our country. But at any rate, he was talking about how, in light of what we had seen in the month of July or June, excuse me, it was very difficult for him to actually celebrate the United States of America this year. I'm going to drop the video here in the live chat for you guys in case anybody wants to go to it. His reasons for this, to be more specific, were the mass amounts of mass shootings that have been going on, the debauchery that is Pride Month and Pride parades, which at one point were actually, resigned to places like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Tel Aviv, San Francisco, New York, right? Places like that, but which nowadays are showing up in every city with a greater than 100,000 population, and probably even some of the cities that are under that margin. Boise definitely had one. I'm sure Coeur d'Alene had one up north, and I'm sure that Pocatello had one in the east. I'm sure if you're going to Cheyenne and to Burlington, Vermont, and to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and all these other places, they're probably having them as well. And of course, for those of you who are paying attention, we know that these are not just simply rallies to celebrate something that we obviously as Christians consider to be sexually perverse, but even if you're not a Christian, something that is, we'll just say a sexual orientation, a sexual lifestyle, right? Not only is it an abject celebration of that, but it's actually this kind of weird thing where the homosexual community, in a effort to try to convince everybody that they are in fact not sexually debased, acts as sexually debased as they possibly could, including but not limited to wearing little to sometimes no clothing. Some people were filming pornography in certain places for their OnlyFans or what have you, twerking and dancing and doing all that other kind of stuff, sometimes in the presence of children. And of course, we can just go on and on and on and on and on. And besides the school shootings and besides the pride parades, we also had the visceral reaction to Roe v. Wade on the part of the left. Groups like Jane's Revenge, for example, saying that they were going to have continually escalating hostilities against those of us who are pro-life. And that's something that I've been telling you guys to expect, by the way, because the violence will indeed increase as a result of us winning that particular battle and as a result of us fighting the actual war now. Because remember, the war on abortion only began with the repeal of Roe v. Wade. That was not part of that battle. The battle had not yet began, right? But nonetheless, he keeps going on about these different things, and he talks about how it's kind of difficult to celebrate the United States of America this year, even in spite of the awesome rulings that we got in the month of June, not only in regards to abortion, but also in regards to a teacher's right to pray at his local church and New Yorkers' rights to have concealed carry, as far as firearms and stuff like that is concerned. A lot of good things in the courts is the point. But nonetheless, Dr. James White's point is taken. And I personally recommend that everybody watch the first 30 minutes of the July 4th, 2022 dividing line and really take to heart what it is that he's saying. We are in a dying nation, ladies and gentlemen. We are in a nation that is dying on every single front. We are dying in regards to our education system. Our economy is crap. Our military is worthless. Even our arts are pathetic, right? We have things like abstract art that's actually considered, PhD level art, right? These people get their. I remember one time I heard a story of a monkey. Somebody had his monkey splatter paint, and the man was able to sell it for hundreds of thousands of dollars on eBay because people thought that it was such great art. We have things like Cardi B and Lizzo as our top musicians. For as bad as people thought Elvis Presley and the Beatles were, they were never like this. We have movies that are really just repeat of yesteryear's movies, which themselves were sequels of yesteryear's movies before. The point is, even the arts, your sports, all gone to crap. Religion has gone to crap. Everything seemingly is going to crap. We're in a dying nation. We're in a Romans 1 nation. We're in the kind of nation that Paul would have to write an epistle to its church, right? And I don't think a lot of us properly grasp that, to be honest with you. I don't think a lot of us properly grasp just how bad it is, just how morally debased everything actually is. John Adams, the second president of the United States and also one of our founders, has a quote saying, and by the way, he's one of the people who was instrumental in the passing of this bill and the establishment of our local government, so his opinion might actually be worth something. But he has a quote saying, "Our Constitution is designed for a religious and moral people. It is wholly unfit for any other." It is wholly unfit for any other. And that's actually a small portion of a much longer letter where he goes in depth discussing why it is necessary to be a religious and moral people in order for us to have a functioning constitution. And the point of it all is just to say, we are dying, and the cure is the thing that kept us from dying to begin with. The cure is a solid and rigid morality, a conservative morality, and indeed a Christian morality, from which those other two ultimately derive. The Muslims have a very solid sense of morality in the sense of its rigidity, but obviously there's no justice there. The communists have a very solid sense of morality in the sense of its rigidity, but obviously there is no justice there. There's nothing conserved there. The Bible provides a very solid sense of morality in its rigidity, and it also provides us a very conservative morality, and it's the only one that will give us the two. So, as Doug Wilson would say, we're not going to have revival in the courts, we're not going to have revival in the Congress, we're not going to have revival in the local governments until we have revival in the pews. So definitely consider checking out that video there. Again, it is James White's July 4th, 2022 episode of The Dividing Line. The first 30 minutes in particular, although I think the whole thing was great, but the first 30 minutes in particular are what got me to start speaking about what I'm speaking about. And be aware. Be aware. The nation is terminal currently, but we worship a miracle-working God. So perhaps that can go away. Regardless, I'm going to go ahead and move on to some of my articles. There's a lot of them. They're very interesting. Not all of them are interesting, but, well, I guess all of them are interesting. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it. But not all of them are particularly comforting. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and jump right into them. So the first thing that we are going to be talking about today is it's kind of a short thing, which is in Britain, there is more attacks on, quote, being female at all, end quote, because having the audacity to be born a woman, much like it has been in more primitive and pagan cultures, is becoming a frowned upon thing in this modern world, unless, of course, you're absolutely gorgeous and voluptuous and are willing to show that to everybody via your OnlyFans. What is it? Budgeting for that particular kind of femininity. All other kinds of femininity are constantly under attack. Female sports, under attack. The idea that women are the childbearing of the genders, under attack. The idea that women have a place as mothers, under attack. Even the Woman of the Year award has now twice, since 2016, gone to a man who is pretending to be a woman. And I mean no disrespect to transgenders, but you cannot possibly transition. It's not a real thing, okay? You are born a male, then you are a male. You are born a female, then you are a female. But I digress. Constantly, we are told that femininity in the form of modest women's clothing or skirts, which are female in particular, or being a wife, or being a mother, or even just being female at all in the sense of these sports, we're constantly told that that's a bad thing. We're constantly having the uniqueness of that thing removed, allowing people like Leah Thomas to do sports, saying that there's birthing persons rather than women, right? It's a constant problem, and we're just having more of it in Britain. But the reason I wanted to talk about this here today is because this is actually the original attack on women. It just hasn't actually spread all throughout the system, by which I mean the world. And I wanted to speak about this article because I wanted to kind of hammer home on where this all started with all of y'all, right? So let's go ahead and get to the article at hand here. I'm going to share my screen. And let's see here. All right. School bans skirts in new gender-neutral uniform policy to stop girls from abusing the rules. So again, school bans skirts in new gender-neutral uniform policy to stop girls from abusing the rules. Now, how exactly were they abusing these rules? Well, basically, doing the kinds of things that not just young girls, but indeed women are prone to do, and indeed humans are prone to do. In the case of women, it's in the form of hiking the skirts up to show a little leg. But what I mean by that is all humans like to show off their bodies to the other sex. It's an unfortunate part of our nature. But nonetheless, it is something that we all expect, right? Not something that should be okay, but something that we all expect. But nonetheless, so that's the abuse of the rules they're talking about. And they decided the way they were going to get around that was to ban skirts and to go with a new gender neutral uniform policy. Um, Again, this is what we see as an elimination of the feminine in an official way, right? Saying no, we're going to do it all the same sort of way. And one of the things that is particularly feminine is skirts, right? Even short skirts are still particularly feminine, although I'm sure there's a lot of people who would probably like to change that, but nonetheless. And this is actually where the whole thing started if you go back throughout history. Now, I'm not about to get up here and talk about how it's evil and sinful to wear pants. That's not what I mean, right? However, I am going to come down here and talk about the fact that there is indeed been a trend in Western society over time to make the only acceptable, quote, feminine clothes sexual feminine clothes. And any non-sexual feminine clothes like skirts and dresses and even bell bottoms are typically tossed to the wayside because, again, the only acceptable form of femininity is Jezebel femininity, the kind of femininity that causes you to simulate lesbian sex at the Oscars. Looking at you, Cardi B. That's the only femininity that anybody wants. Any other form of femininity has to be done away with in the name of gender neutrality. And while they certainly claim that this is about the hiking up of the skirts, we're going to figure out pretty soon that that is indeed not the case as we go through this article. Obviously, it's not like they are unaware of the fact that this is something that is, quote, beneficial to the LGBTQ community. But moving forward, a UK secondary school has scrapped skirts and opted for a more gender-neutral uniform for students. From September, all students at Tiverton High School will be required to wear trousers after the school implemented uniform modifications. Parents were informed of the changes on June 9th, with the only exception to the Devon school's new rule being PE sessions. The new trouser-only policy was announced by the school in a bid to make uniforms more gender-neutral, but also to stop girls wearing skirts that are shorter than knee length. As well as implementing the change to have a more gender-neutral uniform, it was also announced due to a persistent problem of girls wearing their skirts shorter than knee length. So you kind of have the little bit of the gun being jumped there, right? Where they say, actually, what we really were going for is a gender-neutral uniform. But also, we do actually have this secondary thing. But of course, that secondary thing is the thing that I just told you is the only form of acceptable femininity. So how could they possibly be against that? Well, let's keep reading. Sammy Cook, the teacher's headmistress, said, quote, "We will follow other secondary schools in implementing a more gender-neutral uniform policy. Parents, carers will be pleased to know that the majority of the uniforms will remain as it is, the exception that from September, all students will be expected to wear trousers, end quote. Adding, quote, we never take decisions like this lightly and go through a detailed process over time in order to get to come to the right conclusions of our students and the school, end quote. New quote, the change the uniform policy has the approval of our governors and balances the demands placed on us in matters including standards of education, parental costs, inclusivity, and student health. There's that buzzword there, inclusivity, but nonetheless, end quote. The headmistress has said it was frustrating and time consuming to enforce the school skirt length policy that was being abused by girls and had attracted many complaints from the public and from visitors to the school. Ms. Cook also added that she believed trousers, quote, trousers also standardize how our students dress so that we and they can focus on what we consider to be our primary objective, learning, end quote. She added that it had become frustrating and time consuming to staff to keep, for staff, excuse me, to keep having to enforce the school's skirt length policy. Parents have reacted to the news, excuse me, on social media, with one mother writing, ultimately, this rule is fundamentally sexist. They would never insist that all boys wear skirts, which, by the way, that's actually true. That is actually a accurate use of the word sexist, is that in the sense that they are eliminating a feminine thing, but they would never do the same to the males, right? So that certainly is an accurate way of putting this, and that's an accurate usage of the word sexist. The fact that they can insist that girls wear trousers is purely because they are female, and therefore the decision has been made on account of their gender. It strips them of choice and is therefore sexist, end quote. And I'm sure she probably has some secondary reasons for thinking that as well. But nonetheless, I just want to point out that is certainly true. Some questioned whether the trouser rule would also apply to female staff, while another Facebook user said, so the argument is about making the school gender neutral or about changing a uniform because the latter is simple, but the first is taking away the right of existing genders to suit others. It has far bigger implications. Wearing a uniform never eradicated the rich family or poor family outlook, so why not have freedom of choice to feel comfortable in your own skin? There's no need to head it, gender neutral at all. You're all unique in your own ways, whatever path you've chosen. I thought that this was about teaching acceptance to those who choose, not to push the ways of others on all, end quote. And I don't really care for that particular quote, but do you notice what you didn't find in this article? I immediately did. They didn't actually revoke the length policy, right? They didn't actually revoke the length policy. So, in other words, there is still a length policy in place, which presumably could be abused, right? But now you have to wear trousers rather than skirts. For those of you who might not know the British lingo, trousers is what they would call pants, right? The male version of clothing, right? And by the way, for the record, what they call shorts is short trousers. So there you have that. Notice they have no revoking of the length policy, and in fact, there are indeed people who have tweeted out about this, talking about, okay, so we're still going to have this policy of make sure you only have your skirt a certain length, or in this case, your trousers a certain length, and we're still going to have the same problem with enforcing those things, but now it's gender neutral. And of course, what would happen if they did decide to get rid of these shorts? Well, I think you guys know, because it's happened before here in the United States, right? But I want to just point out that it is entirely accurate to say this is sexist. It is entirely accurate to say that it is pointless, considering the fact that they don't actually have any change to their length policy at all. And it is an example of just simply trying to eliminate femininity, as we constantly see. But obviously, that's not the biggest thing we're going to be talking about today, so we spent a short amount of time on it. Let's go ahead and get to our next area of discussion. Actually, really quickly before we do, I just want to point two things out. Number one, modesty is a good thing and should be enforced in the workplace and should be enforced at schools. I, for one, if I was running a school, I can tell you with absolute certainty that there would be a certain level of gender neutrality, in the sense that all of you guys are expected to wear clothing that is at least knee length, that is at least elbow length, that does not show off your chest, that is not excessively tight, right? Now, that is a perfectly acceptable form of gender neutrality that we should support. Obviously not in law. I don't think that the government has the right to tell you how to dress, but a school or your job certainly does. They have a right to say, hey, you You definitely don't get to wear a bra and booty shorts into our establishment, right? Um, but this is an example of what I think is negative form of gender neutrality. And again, this is what started the whole gender neutrality thing way back in the 1920s, right? We're not talking about things like rights, because obviously people could say, well, people were talking about gender neutrality and rights and think, voting rights and stuff like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about as far as like eliminating the distinctions between male and female. All the way back in the 1920s, they were pushing this idea of it's perfectly acceptable for women to dress like men, right? And while in the sense that it's like societally, legally, you could say acceptable, I don't think that it should be societally acceptable. I do think we should have standards that say, hey, this is clearly female, this is clearly male, right? But what was acceptable in the 20s? Well, flappers, right? Kind of the same thing you have in the 60s. We're going to be all gender neutral, well, except for these boy shorts, which is kind of interesting to call them boy shorts. But anyways, um, and it just continues to spread farther and farther. We saw an example of this on the modesty end when people were banning burkinis in France. This is an example on the pure femininity end, saying, no, we're going to actually move forward with a, quote, gender neutral policy that moves to trousers. And I completely agree with the mother there who had said, this is fundamentally sexist because you would never ask it in reverse. And that's exactly accurate. You would never ask for it in reverse. By the way, you shouldn't ask for it in reverse. But what is the implication there? It's trying to eliminate femininity. Trousers, jeans, pants, are boy clothes. So if everybody has to wear boy clothes, what kind of clothes aren't going to be showing up? That would be girl clothes, right? Except, of course, for the short shorts and the skinny jeans. We'll go ahead and make gender distinctions in that sense. Although certain subgenres of the metal industry would certainly like to make a difference there. But you guys know what I mean. We'll allow you to be sexualized. We'll be okay with that particular form of femininity. But blouses, dresses, that kind of stuff, no, sorry. We're going to move that out for a new woman, a braver world. Maybe people think that I'm ranting about something that's ridiculous. I personally don't. I see this as just as much as an assault on femininity as the assault on motherhood, the assault on being a wife, the assault on on childbearing, the assault on women's sports. We're not going to allow you to be gender neutral in the way you present yourself unless you're being a hooker. I don't know. I think that maybe we don't have a big enough problem with it. But let's move on to the next article. This one is going to be the headline article for today, actually. Israel and Egypt have signed a gas export deal as Europe seeks Russian alternative. Israel and Egypt signed gas export deal as Europe seeks Russian alternative. This was originally published on June the 16th. Let me go ahead and get my headline up there. Originally published on June 16th on WAPO. And this is it's an interesting development in the, forget the Europe and Russian, what would you call that, relations, excuse me. Obviously, those are terrible and kind of just perpetually so. They only get worse. They never get better. Sometimes they get more peaceful in the sense that people aren't shooting each other, but they never actually get better. But Israel and Russia's relationship has been deteriorating as of late. There was about a month ago, maybe a little over a month ago at this point, Russian military on the ground in Syria actually firing upon the Israeli Air Force in Syria. That was certainly super interesting. The Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, does not have the relationship with Vladimir Putin that Benjamin Netanyahu had, for better or worse. But in the case of their relationship, it's certainly for worse. And then you also have Israel and Egypt signing this gasoline deal with Europe curving Russia as a result, which is partially Russia's own fault, of course. They're the ones who attacked Ukraine. But I digress. We're not really interested in what's going on between Europe and Russia. We're more interested here, at least for my purposes, on what's going on between Israel and Europe, and Russia. I think it's incredibly interesting. But nonetheless, go ahead and read the article here. Israel, Egypt, and the European Union on Wednesday signed a trilateral natural gas agreement in Cairo as Europe scrambles to cobble together an energy strategy to replace the Russian supplies it has relied on for decades. The deal, which has been in the works since March, obviously when the war in Ukraine started, will enable Israel to streamline and increase the export of its natural gas through already existing pipelines to Egyptian ports, where it can be pressurized and liquefied and then transported to Europe. Quote, this will contribute to our energy security, and we are building infrastructure fit for renewables, the energy of the future, end quote. Ursula von der Leyen, president of the European Commission, tweeted Wednesday from Cairo with a photo of the signing. Israel in recent weeks, this is recent as of June 16th, Israel in recent weeks had promised to accelerate its gas output as demand grew and prices soared. It is looking in collaboration with other Middle Eastern countries to sell to Europe, previously the largest client of Russian energy. And there's two, I think, important takeaways from this. We're not necessarily saying anybody is a bad guy here, by the way. This is just stuff that I think is important to discuss. There's two important takeaways I think we can take from this. And that is that number one, this is going to be something that lasts longer than the Russo-Ukrainian war, provided the Lord tarries that long, of course. But assuming he does, this is going to be something that even when that war has ended, even when Vladimir Putin is dead, even when, Lord willing, there's actually a republic established, a true functioning republic established in Russia, if indeed such a thing does occur. Even when all of that happens, this will still likely be in play. And what that means is Europe and Russia not cooperating with each other on energy the way they were before. Russia's kind of getting curved out of the global economy as a result of starting this war, which again is, it's their own fault. They're the ones who decided to invade Ukraine. But obviously what that means for the future is that there's going to be more hostility between Europe and Russia, or at least less incentive to cease hostility, and likely the same of Russia and Israel, right? The other thing we can take away from this is that Israel's probably about to get relatively wealthy. Not that they're poor by any stretch of the imagination. They're certainly a first world country. Obviously, nobody's really quite as wealthy as the richest parts of the United States or as the United States as a whole. But nonetheless, this is probably going to create a little bit of a boom in the Israeli economy. And what exactly the effects of that will be in the Middle East, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. For my money, I can say that it'll probably provoke a little bit of friendliness with Israel on the part of major Gulf powers like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and probably some what's the unfriendliness, I guess, on the part of Israel's enemies, Iran, Afghanistan, the Palestinians, Turkey, all of which happen to be quite friendly with either China or Russia or both, right? And so in a way, even though there's not really a villain here, it's not like anybody necessarily did anything wrong here. Sometimes it's just the way things work. In a way, what we see here in the signing of this gas deal is kind of escalating tensions in regards to this potential big one that we are looking forward to in the future. Big one meaning big war, like a third world war, the thing that everybody was scared about when Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place. Now, cooler heads have prevailed, thank the Lord, but obviously all that tension is still there, all that entangling alliance is still there, all those potential pressure points are still there. And this, in my opinion, just kind of strains everything a little bit more because it makes the sides, well, number one, it makes them a little bit clearer, right? Israel has traditionally had a friendly relationship with Russia, at least since 1991 when the Soviet Union fell. That's obviously going to be less true now. Also, it's going to provoke the enemies of Israel to want to become a little bit more watchdoggy, shall we say, a little bit more aware of what's going on, right? A little bit more prepared for a stronger Israel. They're already friends with each other. They're already friends with Russia. So it's only going to strengthen those bonds, which of course is in turn likely to strengthen bonds against those groups of countries and therefore strengthen bonds between co-belligerents like Saudi Arabia and Israel, right? Again, saying this without there being any sort of an enemy. But this is the kind of thing that tends to happen when we get in these entangling alliances, right? Certain groups are provoked to become a little bit more friendly with us because they can see the fact that they're going to have to be forced to the side, and certain groups become a little bit more akin to be unfriendly with us. And in this case, the us is Israel, right? Let me know if you guys think I'm off base here. Israel in recent weeks, I just read that, excuse me, quote, with the beginning of this war and the attempt of Russia to blackmail us through energy, by deliberately cutting off the energy supplies, we decided to cut off and to get rid of the dependency on Russian fossil fuels and to move away from Russia and diversify to trustworthy suppliers, end quote. Well, that quotation right there kind of tells you a lot about what I'm currently talking about, doesn't it? Tells you a lot about the fact that this is going to be something that is likely going to continue on into the future. And there'll probably be many more deals like this with other countries because I don't think Israel has enough natural gas to provide all of Europe with a replacement to Russian energy. But nonetheless, at the very least, you can see why I have the fears that I do, or the inklings that I do at least. This was a quote from von der Leyen again, by the way, which she said at a joint news conference with Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett in Jerusalem on Tuesday night at the end of a 2-day visit to Israel and the West Bank. Quote, it's an outstanding step bridging our energy cooperation to the next level, end quote. Bringing, not bridging. My apologies. Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi also met with Bennett on Tuesday to discuss energy cooperation. Excuse me. Claudio Descalzi, the head of Italian oil giant Eni, said last month that Italy aims to be fully independent from Russian gas by the winter of 2024 to 2025. There's again what I'm talking about here as far as this being something that will have lasting implications. This is going to be one of those results of the Russo-Ukrainian war that people write about in history books that people hundreds of years later will read about, wanting to know how exactly this impacted the whole world. On Wednesday, Eni said the state-owned Russian company Gazprom has cut its gas supply, to Italy by 15% since Russia invaded Ukraine in February. Sorry, just trying to pronounce that word correctly. It is February, not February. Anyways, Italy has signed deals with several energy exporting African countries, including Egypt. And there's that I was talking about this becoming a trend, right? It's not just going to stop with Israel per se, right? Egypt is another one of those countries, by the way, who has been willing to, along with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, nations like that, be more friendly with Russia and therefore be less friendly with Iran, with the Palestinians, with Turkey, with Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. For Israel, the sudden energy shortfall in Europe is an opportunity to get involved in a global market that has become exponentially lucrative in recent months. There's that potential wealth I was just talking about. Quote, this is a tremendous moment in which little Israel becomes a significant player, end quote. Israeli Energy Minister Karen El-Harar said Wednesday in a statement. Experts say Israel's supply, extracted from 3 offshore Mediterranean gas fields, will be nowhere near Russian capacity. And of course not, right? Russia's tiny. Russia's the size of New Jersey, Israel, my apologies. Israel is the size of New Jersey. Russia, on the other hand, is the size of America plus, right? So not just New Jersey, but the entire contiguous United States, as well as all of our territories, as well as Hawaii and Alaska, and then some. Russia's the largest country by land mass on the entire planet. Little itty bitty Israel is again the size of New Jersey. It's one of the smallest countries in the world. So obviously it's not going to actually replace everything here, but we've already addressed that. Israel produces roughly 12 billion cubic meters of natural gas a year, though industry analysts, say at least double that amount exists in unexploited reserves. In 2021, the European Union imported 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia, accounting for about 45% of EU gas imports. Okay, let's just look at those numbers again real quick. 12 billion cubic meters of natural gas is how much Israel produces in total. That is the entire amount of natural gas produced by Israel. Russia, on the other hand, was able to export to Europe alone 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas. That does not include exports elsewhere, nor does it include anything that they keep for domestic use, right? That is a ton of oil. It's a pretty huge void to fill. And like I said, it's obviously not going to stop with Israel in the sense they even already mentioned that there's been a gas deal signed with Egypt as well. I'm sure Saudi Arabia will get in on that, even though there was a little bit of time where people were trying to get away from Middle Eastern oil. That probably is going to be something that we're even more reliant upon now. Um, Obviously, the United States could be exporting quite a bit of it, but that good old semi-sentient bowl of pudding in the White House is not going to allow us to export any oil, nor for us to actually get it ourselves. But I digress on that, although I probably shouldn't. Obviously, that's a pretty big deal. We could be making a lot of money off of this. We could also be saving a lot of money off of this. In the sense that we would be, having oil here that we're getting from here, and therefore not paying somebody else for, right? By the way, for those of you who are keeping score, what Russia was able to export was just 1 million under 13 times Israel's entire production. And as the article actually mentioned here, it was 45% of the EU's gas imports. But Alex Coman, an energy expert at Tel Aviv University, said Israel's contribution is becoming increasingly important as the Ukraine war thrusts Europe toward a more fragmented strategy in which it will buy smaller amounts of energy from a number of different countries. It's exactly what we were just talking about. Quote, beyond just the war in Ukraine, Europe is so traumatized from Russian brutality, end quote, that it has moved toward a general restructuring of its energy system, quote, to avoid having dependence on one energy source, end quote, he said, and specifically on Russia as an energy source, right? Which again, not saying anybody's a bad guy here, but what we have to understand about the geopolitical sphere as a result of this is it gets more divided, more polarized, right? Those who are on one side link together even stronger. Those who are on the other side link together even stronger. And stragglers who have refused to link, on either side, the lukewarm, right? They are going to be forced to pick a side pretty soon. Obviously, at that point, all you need is a little spark and the whole thing goes kablamo. In May, the London-based the London-based Energean, I don't know how you say that. Anyways, exploration and production company announced that it had made a new commercial gas discovery of about 8 billion cubic meters off the coast of Israel. The company's current project involves some 100 billion cubic meters in reserves and is slated to come online in September. Energean CEO Matthias Regis said that more pipelines were still needed to fully exploit the Eastern Mediterranean's offshore supplies, and that although Europe needs gas today, there are no magic solutions, which is true. By the way, that is another area of potential conflict because both Russia and Turkey, in particular, would want to also get in on that Mediterranean oil. And in fact, natural resources are the number one reason for fights to break off ever, right? To break out ever, excuse me. Beyond infrastructure, he said the industry is challenged by both below surface, the rocks that, quote, below surface, the rocks, the geology, and above surface issues and disputes, end quote, in a region that has for decades been marred by conflict, which is what I was just talking about as far as this being another potential area of fighting. Those issues surfaced this month when Lebanon protested the arrival of one of Energen's floating rigs and claimed that the gas fields in question lie within its territorial waters. Which, by the way, Lebanon is another one of those ones that isn't firmly on any side, though they are allied with Iran, who themselves is allied with China and Russia. So you can see that they'll probably be pushed more to that side as a result of this situation, as a result of this deal. Israel has said the area is well within its exclusive economic zone. Lebanon is expected to drop the claim after a meeting in Beirut held this week with the U.S. Senior Advisor for Energy Security, Amos Hochstein, according to officials who spoke with the Reuters news agency. Wednesday's export deal, which this is Wednesday, on June 16th. So the actual date then, I guess I don't know what day June 16th was. I think Juneteenth was on a Sunday. So that would be June 15th is the Wednesday in question. But anyways, Wednesday's export deal comes a day after the Russian state-owned company Gazprom said it would cut capacity on the Nord Stream pipeline, the largest gas supply link to the EU, by 40% following repair delays, boosting already elevated natural gas prices by 15%. And of course, they've only boosted since then. In numerous places here in the United States, gas is upwards of $6. In numerous places in Europe, it's up to $7 and $8. Absolutely absurd. But nonetheless, gas is going up everywhere across the planet. The EU has worked with the United States and other allies to impose sanctions on Moscow, but several member countries remain heavily reliant on Russian oil and gas. And this was written by Shira Rubin, who was with the Washington Post. Want to give credit where credit is due. So, kind of talked that into the ground already, so we're not going to comment too much. But to recap, Israel and Egypt have signed gas exporting deals to Europe because Europe is fed up with dealing with Russia's nonsense. Russia obviously caused this themselves by starting a war. And as a result, I think you're going to see the anti-Russian side, which is also the anti-Iranian side, which is also the anti-Chinese side, become more and more linked with each other, become more and more reliant upon each other, be more exclusory to the other groups, right? The Chinas, the Lebanons, the North Koreas, the Afghanistans, the Brazils. There's actually quite a bit of people who are going to be on the other side here. But this is just another development in us getting towards that kind of a situation, which of course is a very pre-World War I kind of situation, and then also in a very serious way, pre-World War II as well. All right, so the last thing that we're going to be talking about is potential gun control coming. Maybe, possibly. We don't really know. But nonetheless, there has been some bipartisan legislation passed with people saying that they are going to actually work together in these sort of gun control measures. Also, there has been some stricter crackdown in New York that we won't be able to talk about too much, as a result of what the Supreme Court had ruled. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and look at this gun control bill. Let me bring it up here. All right. This was about 4 weeks ago, but it's been a while since we've actually been able to talk about stuff, so we're constantly having to catch up on stuff. It's obviously my fault, but nonetheless, we'll be done with this here soon. All right, so this is from Certainly Not News, our good friend CNN. What did you think it stood for? Something different? Anyways, House passes sweeping gun reform package, though it's unlikely to move in the Senate. I believe it actually did move in the Senate. This looks like it's probably an older article. Yeah, June 9th it says. So let me see if I can find a more updated article on the bill. I'm fairly certain that it did actually move through the Senate. Let's see here. Well, I did just find a much more recent article on it, so we'll move on to that. Forget Certainly Not News. We'll go to the New York Times, which are just so much more trustworthy. But, whatever. Unfortunately, the only trustworthy news sites we can get on are things like InfoWars, but, hard to find them these days considering they're banned everywhere. Got to actually go to their website. I digress. The promises and pitfalls of the new gun law. Keep in mind, this is going to have a very liberal bias towards it, but we obviously want information on the new gun law. So that's why we're talking about it. President Biden has heralded the recent gun safety bill as the most significant federal attempt to reduce gun violence in 30 years. By the way, what he's referencing is 30 years ago, they passed an all-around assault weapons ban. Some of you guys probably don't remember that. It happened before a lot of us, myself included, were even born. It was revoked, I think, in 2004, if I remember correctly. But if you're a gun nut, you probably tried to buy a weapon that was produced in that time, like a Galil, for example. One of those ones that you would see on Call of Duty. It's probably why these things got popular. And have found it incredibly difficult to do so. A lot of times being forced to actually buy the parts individually and then assemble the gun yourself. A big part of the reason for that is because there was a law banning assault rifles. I believe its exact verbiage was a ban on assault rifle imports. And I think it was, I can't remember when exactly it was passed. Might have been the 90s, but I also want to say the late 80s. Anyways, That's what he's referencing when he says federal attempt to reduce gun violence in 30 years. After a gunman opened fire from a rooftop onto a 4th of July parade in Chicago suburb, which obviously that did occur. I don't cover those things because I don't want to feed into the narrative. But anyways, questions about about what the landmark legislation will and will not achieve. Background setting: 6 people are killed and dozens more wounded in the deadly shooting at a parade in Highland Park, Illinois. Thoughts and prayers, of course, go out to the families. A suburb of Chicago, the police have taken a 22-year-old man into custody, and may he be swiftly executed after being found guilty. Although Illinois doesn't do that sort of thing anymore because they're a bunch of pansies. But, obviously, he gets his day in court. We want to make sure everything goes through smoothly. And I would support him being executed afterwards, publicly, to make an example out of him. Preferably with a bag over his head and everybody blacking out his name. But that would be maybe a little bit too, I don't know, totalitarian. Might be a little weird. Gun violence researchers have waged an often frustrating battle to translate their findings into public policy. I told you guys this is going to have a liberal bias towards it. And here's what's in the gun safety law, officially called the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. What a swell name. And what was left out. Why did it stop there? That's ridiculous. We're going to get here. Don't worry. Senate on Thursday passed a bipartisan bill aimed at keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, the product of a compromise that could bring about the most substantial gun safety legislation in decades. By the way, you'll notice that they're using the words bipartisan here. That is because a lot of your Republican lawmakers, both in the Congress and in the Senate, voted for this bill. A lot of them, actually. Obviously, not all of them. It wasn't something that was, that was universal by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely a good deal of them. I think the official vote was 65-33. There is 48 Republicans in the Senate, so you can do the math for yourself. That means that at least 15 of them would have had to vote in favor of this bipartisan gun control bill. And I'm actually going to go ahead and pull up each of their individual names so that we can spread the news there. The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, written by a small group of Republicans and Democrats in the aftermath of back-to-back mass shootings, would enhance background checks for gun buyers between 18 and 21 years old, would incentivize states to enact red flag laws that enable firearms to be temporarily confiscated from people deemed dangerous, and provide hundreds of millions of dollars for mental health and school safety. It would also extend to dating partners a federal law that prohibits domestic abusers from purchasing guns. All right, so 2 things that you guys need to be aware of in this. Number 1, what is a red flag law? Obviously, most states, and I would be willing to bet all states, already have laws that allow you to have your firearms taken away given due process of law. So what would be the point of having a law that enables firearms to be temporarily confiscated from people deemed dangerous? Well, red flag laws don't need due process of law. When a red flag law is passed, you call the police and say such and such a person is a threat to themselves, their family, or other people, right? And the police, without a warrant, and the police, without a court order, come in and take the firearms away until the person is deemed not to be a threat. That is the difference between red flag laws and what we already have on the books. So that's the first thing you need to know. The second thing here, it would also extend to dating partners a federal law that prohibits domestic abusers from purchasing guns. What that would basically mean is if you are dating, not married, and somebody, has had a domestic violence issue in the relationship, that they would have to, have basically they'd be prohibited from buying firearms, which sounds great to some people. Unfortunately, that means that you're going to have to get the government involved in your dating life. So that's one of the first things you need to immediately mention. And the second thing that's important here to mention is everybody on the entire planet knows probably 2 to 3 times the amount of liars in a dating relationship than in a actual relationship. One of the great things about being married is that it incentivizes you not to screw over the other party for reasons of vendetta, right? Because you got to get the law involved in courts and all that other kind of stuff, even in the age of no fault-based divorce, right? You got to get involved as far as sorry, got dogs here. Got to get people involved as far as, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought here. Things like children, things like alimony, things like, which stuff is going where, all that other kind of stuff. It's a huge process to tell a lie about somebody and break up with them when you're married. Not so much when you're dating. In fact, I'll bet everybody here who is watching this video probably knows somebody who everything was perfectly fine and peachy, and then as soon as something went wrong and they broke up, now all of a sudden this person was Adolf Hitler incarnate. Well, now that's going to potentially have the backing of the law coming in and saying, hey, you're not actually allowed to buy firearms. So definitely important things to mention there. 15 Republicans crossed party lines to side with Democrats in support of the measure, which passed 65-33. The 80-page bill falls short of the toughest gun control measures that Democrats have long sought, but its enactment would still represent a remarkable breakthrough after years of stalemate in Congress, on addressing gun violence in the United States. To win over Republicans, Democrats had to drop some of their more expansive proposals, many of which have passed the House but stalled in the Senate and Republican opposition. So, just to be clear, the other side actually wants everything that happened to be worse than it actually is. So, that's an important thing for us to point out there. Let me go ahead and pull up the names of who voted for it, because that's really what I want to know. All right. We'll get to that after the article. Enhanced background checks for younger gun buyers. Juvenile records, including those regarding mental health, would for the first time be required in criminal background checks for prospective gun buyers under the age of 21. And authorities would have more time to conduct the checks, 10 days up from the current 3. Under the legislation, federal authorities would have to check with local law enforcement and review state records to determine if a prospective buyer has a juvenile, criminal, or mental health history that would disqualify them from purchasing a gun. Okay. Who on the planet does not have some sort of a mental health history as a teenager? Maybe not all of it's diagnosed, but it's literally a meme in the modern day that, not just in the modern day, but just in general, that teenagers are angsty, right? The teenagers have a bunch of hormones that they don't know how to control. They're always depressed. They're always anxious. They're always mad at stuff. Get out of my room, Dad. All that other kind of stuff, right? Now that's going to have the weight of law behind it. Under the legislation, federal authority, preventing people from owning firearms because of that is going to have the weight of law behind it. Let me be clear. Under the legislation, federal authorities would have to check with local law enforcement and review a state record to determine if a prospective buyer has a juvenile, criminal, or mental health history. That would also include things like smoking cigarettes too young, by the way. That would disqualify them from purchasing a gun. If they found such a record, they would turn it over to the FBI to further investigate. So we're going to have the FBI investigating 20-year-olds who want to purchase firearms because they might have smoked cigarettes or been incorrigible. Not even a joke. The proposal falls far short of legislation that has passed the House that would ban anyone under the age of 21 from buying a semi-automatic weapon. So what the Democratic Party actually wanted was to make it so you had to be at least 21 years old to buy any semi-automatic weapon, period. And thank God that did not pass. Democrats also agreed to allow the enhanced background check requirement for younger buyers to expire after 10 years, leaving future Congress to haggle over whether it should be extended, and they will extend it. You can mark my words. A similar sunset provision allowed the federal assault weapons ban enacted in 1994 to lapse in 2004 to the dismay of Democrats, who have never been able to muster enough support to revive it. I know that probably runs in the face of what I just said, but we're getting increasingly liberal as time is moving on. There is a limit on how long authorities would be able to reach back into a buyer's mental health history. Such records from before a potential buyer turned 16 could not disqualify them from buying a gun. Incentives for states to implement red flag laws. The bill would provide $750 million in federal money to states that create so-called red flag laws, which allow guns to be temporarily confiscated from people deemed dangerous by a judge. Now, when you see deemed dangerous by a judge, you need to understand this is not in a trial. This is very similar to the kind of stuff we have in the USA Patriot Act, right? Where you have some sort of a secret judge who does not have a Well, first off, it does not have to give you any knowledge that they're actually ruling on you at all, right? So you don't get to face your accuser in that instance. You have no, um, you know, defense attorneys or anything like that. There's no jury to hear the case. There's not even a prosecuting attorney. You simply have the law enforcers, quote unquote, who want to actually have this thing enacted. They send it over to the judge. The judge looks over it, decides, hey, you know what, I agree, or much less likely, hey, you know what, I don't agree. And they move forward and do their stuff. And by the time you even know you've been accused of anything, you already have your firearms confiscated. Or in the case of the USA Patriot Act, you already actually have been, excuse me, already have been spied upon, right? And by the way, $750 million for these states. Where is this money coming from? $750 million from where? From the taxpayer. The taxpayers don't have that much money, hence the reason why we've printed 60% of all existing dollars in the last 2 years. Obviously, we have a greater tax increase when these things happen, but even the money we get in taxes is not enough to pay for it. So they print money. Printing money causes inflation. Inflation makes your life horrible. Now we have what a lot of people call the inflation tax on the Ron Paulian side of things, where everything like your gasoline, your eggs, your milk, your Special K is all more expensive. And they just want to go ahead and spend more money willy-nilly by saying, hey, anybody who actually passes these unconstitutional laws will literally bribe you with $750 million that we don't actually have. The funding meant to incentivize the enacting of such measures, but also support the creation of crisis intervention court programs. Excuse me. So, what was left out? Democrats wanted to go farther than providing incentives to states and enact a federal red flag measure passed in the House that would allow guns to be taken from anyone deemed by a federal judge to be dangerous. Which, again, thank God they didn't go that far. But if you're keeping score at home, their goal is to ban semi-automatic weapons in any form, going to any 21-year-old or younger, and to make sure that the federal government can actually deem you unworthy of having your guns and then show up at your front door and take them from you. You know, for crazy things like thinking that they shouldn't teach CRT in schools or that they shouldn't have a drag queen story hour. You know, that kind of bizarre stuff. Obvious sarcasm is obvious. Moving on. Closing the boyfriend loophole. One of the bill's last sticking points was a provision to toughen federal law to keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers. It would expand current law that bars people convicted of domestic violence or subject to a domestic violence restraining order from buying a gun. The current law applies, only to people who are married to or lived with the victim or had a child with them. The legislation would include other intimate partners, closing what has come to be known as the boyfriend loophole. What was left out? Democrats wanted a blanket prohibition, but in negotiations with Republicans, they agreed to allow some offenders to regain the ability to purchase a gun. So they wanted to just say anybody who's been accused of domestic violence would be banned entirely, whereas the Republicans said, no, we need to allow them some time, afterwards to eventually get their rights back. If a person is a first-time offender and the crime is a violent misdemeanor, the ban would disappear 5 years after the end of their criminal sentence, so long as they did not commit further violent crimes. Negotiators also agreed to not make the provision retroactive, bowing to another demand by Republicans, which would mean anybody who was previously accused of domestic violence would have this applying to them. Well, not accused. To be fair, it does say that you'd have to be convicted of it. So I should be clear on that. The bill would allocate funding for mental health and school safety. The bill would allocate billions of dollars to schools and communities for expanding mental health programs. Again, where is this money coming from? I don't know, the ether, I guess, but nonetheless, they're going to spend it. The funding also aims to boost school safety. The bill grants $300 million over 5 years for school safety programs targeting violence that would fund school resource officers and beef up security in schools. In addition, funding would go to training school personnel and adults who interact with minors to respond to mental health issues. What was left out? Republicans insisted on keeping the cost of the bill as low as possible. Those crazy Republicans. In total, the measure would cost $13.2 billion that we do not have, being a country $30 trillion in freaking debt. Tougher penalties on illegal purchases. The bill would crack down on straw purchasers, or people who buy guns for those who would not qualify. No current law specifically prohibits these purchasers or illegal gun trafficking, so prosecutors have relied on people who make false statements in connection with purchasing a gun. The bill would establish a penalty of up to 15 years in prison or 25 years if the firearms were used in connection with a serious criminal activity like drug trafficking or terrorism. It would also provide resources to help prevent and investigate these purchases. So, you're a 21-year-old, you want to buy a firearm for your 20-year-old younger brother, but he doesn't want to go through all the nonsense checks and balances, so you decide to get it for him. Well, 15 years in prison for you, buddy. 15 Republicans voted for this. What was left out? The bill does not include more sweeping measures to impose universal background checks or ban the sale of large capacity magazines. Thank God. Republicans also said they refused to consider any mandatory waiting period for gun sales or a license requirement to purchase an assault weapon. And again, thank God for those. That's the end of the article. I guess technically we should give credit where it is due. So Stephanie Lai wrote this article along with Emily Cochrane, but you know, they're terrible people, so who cares? So that's what we got going on. To end this episode, let's go ahead and tell you of the 15 Republicans who voted for it. So let's go through here. Just a moment, I'm actually going through one. So we have Republican Blunt from Missouri. Not sure his first name, but if you are in Missouri, be sure to vote him out of office. Again, that is Blunt, B-L-U-N-T, from Missouri. Who else did we have? We had the Republican Burr from North Carolina, who voted for this bill. Capito from West Virginia voted for this bill. Cassidy from Louisiana voted for this bill. Suzanne Collins from Maine, or Susan Collins, voted for this bill. Cornyn from Texas voted for this bill. Cotton from Arkansas decided not to vote, and Kramer from North Dakota decided not to vote. I don't know who they think they're impressing with that, but nonetheless. Ernst from Iowa voted yes on this bill. I think that's Nebraska. Fisher from Nebraska voted yes on this bill. Lindsey Graham, South Carolina, yes on this bill. Moving through the names here, we obviously got a lot of the Democrats. More Democrats. Rufus King from Maine, an independent, voted yes on this bill. Young from Indiana voted yes on this bill. We have Toomey from Pennsylvania voted yes on this bill. Tillis from North Carolina, who voted yes on this bill. If you're in any of these areas, make sure to vote these people out in the coming midterms. Shelby from Alabama. Nope, sorry, I misread there. That was a nay. Shelby from Alabama is indeed fine. Moving forward. Who else we got? Obviously Sanders, who is an independent, Bernie Sanders from Vermont. But, obviously he's much less conservative than Rufus King, who is not actually conservative, but he's not, quite as crazy as Sanders. Mitt Romney from Utah voted yes on this bill. Portman from Ohio voted yes on this bill. Lisa Murkowski up in Alaska voted yes on this bill. Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, my apologies, in Kentucky voted yes on this bill. I don't know why I said Texas, but at any rate, I believe that might be it for Republicans. Those are the 15 Republican names who voted yes on this bill. Be sure to vote them out of office, and we'll be sure to write those names down so that we can remind you guys, every watchdog, that they voted yes on this bill. Anyways, friends, I'm done. I'm out. It's a pleasure talking to you. If you like this video, please consider liking and sharing the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. I want to remind you guys to be watchdogs, and I also want to ask you the question in the face of Armageddon. Will you compromise?